You're listening to the Youth for Life podcast with Michelle Bound, Director of Y for Life at Lutherans for Life, where we prepare youth to be gospel-motivated voices for life. Be sure to stick around after today's live recording of our Chats for Life program to find out how you can be live too on our next Youth for Life podcast. Hello and welcome to this edition of Chats for Life. We are so excited that you've joined us. And today I have two guests with me. One, my assistant, Cori, if you want to say hi.
Hi, everyone.
And we have our special guest, Vicar Pauling, almost Reverend Pauling, but Vicar Pauling, who's here with us today to talk about the topic of Christ versus AI and transhumanism. And we'll jump in just a minute, but I'm going to have Vicar Pauling start us off with a prayer today.
Sure. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, you are the God who came into the world and took on flesh through your Son, Jesus Christ. We thank you for this wonderful gift of the incarnation, which tells us how good the body is and how you redeem the body and will one day bring about the resurrection on the last day. We pray that that would guide our discussion today as we get into difficult and challenging dilemmas in relation to technology, AI, and transhumanism. And that most of all, your name would be glorified. Through Jesus Christ, we pray. Amen.
Amen. Well, I am so very glad that you're willing to talk to us about this topic because it is a hot one, right? AI and transhumanism, both very similarly related, but there are some distinct differences. And of course, probably most of our viewers have already used AI and encountered AI, right? It would be very, very difficult not to at this point. So
Right.
Can you maybe define for us those terms, AI and then also transhumanism?
Sure. Yeah. Really glad to be here with you all today. And like you said, talk about this challenging topic. So we could define AI in a few different ways, but this will be our working definition for today. The simulation of human intelligence through the use of machines that generate outputs that mimic or predict human responses. Okay, I'll say it again. The simulation of human intelligence through the use of machines that generate outputs that mimic or predict human responses. So if we think about AI today, usually we're thinking of things like ChatGPT, Google Gemini, and so forth, Microsoft Copilot, things that are mimicking and predicting human responses, right, and generating those responses that then we interact with in some way. I think that's a pretty good working definition for AI today. Now, it's not a new idea. AI goes back a long time. There'd long been dreams and hopes of creating some artificial form of intelligence. You even see this in some of the Greek myths. You see it in the medieval era as well. So there's been long sort of wishes for this, but probably the first modern example of a successful AI was actually in the 70s. There was a professor at MIT named Joseph Weizenbaum who developed a program called ELIZA. And this program could simulate psychological conversations, like if you were with a doctor or a psychiatrist, I should say, not psychologist, psychiatrist. And so he ran some experiments with this and would have people come and talk with ELIZA. And what he found is that very quickly people started humanizing ELIZA. And this shocked him. And he really became a prophet of the age of AI and warning people about the dangers of AI and especially humanizing AI. So yeah, there's a little bit of background about AI and what we mean and how we're going to use that term today.
Excellent. That I did not know about this, about ELIZA, about this experiment.
Yeah.
But it definitely makes sense, right? We see the humanization of AI repeatedly today, right? We actually did a podcast, maybe about, I don't know, 6-7 months ago about relationships in AI.
Yes.
Yeah, and where, women and men are choosing AI relationships over physical relationships with someone of the opposite sex.
That's
And
right. AI girlfriends, AI companions. Mm-hmm.
yeah, how scary that is.
Mm-hmm.
Because definitely, I mean, human beings are not exact replicas of what we desire in someone else, right? And it's definitely teaching people to expect the impossible of
That's right.
a relationship. So yeah.
Wow.
Okay, so I didn't even know that that happened.
Yeah, one more thing about that. Actually, at one point, one of the people that were interacting with Eliza actually asked him to leave the room, so he could so that the person who was interacting with Eliza could ask really personal questions.
Really?
Yeah, yeah. So
Oh,
it was just a
wow.
fascinating experiment that revealed a lot, and really led him on I would say, an important sort of prophetic role in writing about this and warning about it long before most people even knew it was possible.
That also just brings up, again, maybe sidetrack, but it certainly proves how relational human beings are, right?
Hmm.
That we desire relationships, and that's
Intimacy.
how we were made. We were
Yeah,
made to be relational people, and God, I mean, very clearly shows that in Genesis 1 and 2, where he provides Adam and Eve and there to become one, right? And he doesn't just have one individual, but we naturally want to be connected with others. But as you were speaking, I was thinking too of all these other things that we humanize, right? That
yeah,
we want to be in a relationship with, whether that is a pet, right? Somebody's
right.
going to call in and be really angry about this podcast, because pets aren't humans, right? And even just items, physical things that we develop this like association with, or um, naming our cars, giving our
Sure.
cars names, or, even just inanimate objects that we humanize. So,
Yeah, totally. And it's a good desire, right, to have relationship, but it's disordered, right? We're
right,
putting the focus on things that aren't going to be able to bring us full intimacy and communion, right? We're designed for relationship, yeah, as you said, and there's really a horizontal element of that, right, with each other. And then
right,
there's a vertical element of that we need as well with God. Right. And if we're not having those desires met in their properly ordered way, right, then we're going to try to fulfill them in all these different ways, and we see the distortions there all over. So what's funny though is that we humanize our machines or things that aren't human, but then we mechanize ourselves. We talk about our
excellent.
bodies as, well-oiled machines, or we talk about our brains as if they're a computer. So this it's sort of it goes both ways here, and neither of them are healthy.
Yeah, tell us more about that, right? Because that leads kind of into transhumanism, and maybe if you can define that, and then tell us more about, your insights, your thoughts,
Sure.
on how we mechanize people.
Yeah, yeah. So transhumanism we could define as really any attempt to transcend or enhance the human body. Okay. So there'd be many forms of transhumanism. There's lots of ways we try to transcend or enhance our body. But transhumanism especially is when we're doing that in a technological way, when we're using some form of technology to do so. And so I'm going to say something a little provocative here, but I want you guys to explain why this would be the case. I'm going to say that transgenderism is a subset of transhumanism.
Agree.
Okay, why would that be the case?
Oh, like I'm just thinking of all those people who their body doesn't look or feel the way they think it should. And that just makes them want to have surgery, take medications, alter something in some way so that it feels like it's supposed to. Or you're talking about like our brains being a computer so that the computer, like the outside matches what that inside is hoping it would be. I don't know. I have a lot of friends who've built computers, and so I'm thinking of it kind of from that way of like they want it to look a certain way. And so they're thinking through like, what's the best aesthetic that I can give this?
Sure. Yeah, as if the real me is my mind, right?
Mhm.
Or my internal sense of self, and I need to have my body align with that. And all sorts of technological ways that we try to do that, right? And transgenderism, you're trying to do that through medical procedures or medicines, right? Those are technologies, right? Those are medical technologies. So I would say, yeah, that's really probably the clearest example that we're familiar of transhumanism. Now, there are more extreme forms. There are people that are trying to upload their consciousness to the internet, that are trying to live forever digitally in that way. There's all sorts of weird sort of religious aspects of some transhumanist groups as well, where they see this as a way really to achieve immortality. It's almost like a distorted form of Christian eschatology, like you're hoping for eternal life, but you're trying to do so in a technological and digital way. So yeah, there's really a lot of things that are going on in the realm of transhumanism. Those are just a few examples.
Yeah, your comments about achieving immortality, again, we we often say that Satan doesn't have a whole lot of a whole lot of cards, right? They just take on different faces. He doesn't have a whole lot of tricks. He just uses the same ones, but transforms them a little bit, tweaks them a little. And isn't that the same temptation that was offered in the Garden of Eden, right? The chance to transform oneself from human being to be like God, right? To know good
Right.
and evil, and to reform yourself into your own image rather into being content with being made in the best image, in the image of God. But this transhumanism is just another face of that, right? To
Sure.
transform us into our own image, into the image we desire. So,
Exactly. I couldn't say it any better. Yep.
and the whole even desire for immortality, right? That's been around
Yeah,
forever. King
exactly.
Arthur. You know,
Yeah, yeah.
all these stories of searching for that immortality, and yet we have it. We have the immortality in our churches every Sunday, right? We have the body and blood of Christ that not only forgives but sustains us forever.
That's
So
right. And the church fathers, Irenaeus particularly, called the Lord's Supper the medicine of immortality, right?
yes,
This
that
is the fountain of youth, right? Not in the sense of living forever physically in that sense, but we will have the resurrection of the body and live forever, right? And we are
right.
participating in that resurrection life, in the life of the church, right? We get foretastes of that. Christ's life is put into ours. So yeah, we have the answers to these questions. It's just sometimes it looks better elsewhere,
Right. We're not content with them. Yeah.
right?
Let's talk about some of maybe the beliefs that we have about technology, right? You I know in your presentation talked about technology being equaling progress, right? Is that true? Does it really mean that just because we have a new technology, we're now further along, we have progressed in some way?
Right. Yeah. Whenever I present on these topics, I try to first take a few steps back and sort of pull back the curtain, if you will, to to give us a framework for thinking about technology in general, because it's a huge topic, right? And I think debunking some of the myths about technology is really important. Yeah. So one of the myths I talked about at the Higher Things presentation was that technology equals progress, as you said. And this is very common. We assume that things are getting better, right? We have new inventions. We can, fly around the world. We can communicate like this, right? Via the internet.
Yeah.
And those can be wonderful blessings, right? Um, but we assume that those things are like equal to moral progress per se, right? That things are automatically better because our technologies are getting better. Another way this comes across is that just because we can do something technologically, we should do something technologically, right? That's the way this sort of manifests itself frequently as well. Well, we have the technology to do this, so we should do it, right? Instead of thinking about the moral implications or the human implications of something. So what I like to do is I like to fix this myth, okay, from technology equals progress to technology equals trade-offs. Technology equals trade-offs. And this is a much healthier way to think about any technology, whether it's a very simple technology to a very complex technology, right? So for example, if we were to talk about the car, for example, okay, we might usually think about, oh, the car meant progress, right? Oh, we could get around more quickly. We could travel across the country to see family and so forth. But it also brought about all sorts of trade-offs, both in the physical environment and in human relationships, right? So maybe let's just run down that rabbit trail a little bit. What are some of the trade-offs that you think the car brought about for society?
Well, you mentioned the car enabling you to see family, but I think in some ways the car also separated us from family, right? So the car the car gives you the ability to move out to the suburbs, right? Or to move into the city. Whereas our family, our community, we had smaller, culturally smaller places to live and to gather, and they were our network, right? And we had to interact with them, but when you have a car, you can leave your network behind, right? The people you work with can live 30 miles away, or 40 miles away. You don't have to see them on a regular basis. And again, the in early America, even you have families that stay close, right?
Right.
Maybe they're a buggy ride away, but in general, they stay around the same area. And so there's this natural upholding of life through your family and through your community. And instead, the car made us a transient culture, right?
Exactly. Yeah, it was something that divided families, right? Family fragmentation is highly correlated to the car as far as when the car really became widespread, when it became adopted and what was happening to families. And as you explained, local community used to be much more central to one's life, right? And it was sort of limited by your transportation technologies, which were either your feet or your horse, right? And that led to a whole different type of living, a more family-centered type of living, where you knew your neighbors, right? You knew your community, you were more involved in your local area and so forth. Yeah, so that's a huge trade-off of the car. I think that's one of the biggest ones for sure. Yeah. Any other
Yeah,
ones?
I was gonna piggyback
Yeah.
off that though, and as you said, like things spread out. We also saw like your towns became less centralized. So I don't know, like for me, I live on the opposite side of town from Walmart. So if I need to go like do any clothes shopping for my kids, it's a 10-15 minute drive to get there. Or, people who live an hour away from their closest shopping in those rural communities or on farms. That became another big trade-off of you couldn't just walk to your neighbor's house to trade goods and services. You have to really think about and plan your trips to get to those places. I have a friend who's a big proponent of putting in more bike trails and walking trails because he doesn't like how decentralized everything has become with cars and just making everything more advantageous for those who may not want to drive a car everywhere or who don't have the money to drive a car everywhere. It's cheaper to have a bike. It's cheaper to walk on your own 2 feet, but it's not as safe. It's not as centrally located to do those things. So that's another one that I was thinking of is
Yeah,
like,
that's really good. It's really insightful. And what's interesting there, what you're getting at is the fact that we build our physical environments for the car,
We
right?
do.
Not for people, right? Think of parking lots, think of highways, right? Highways were frequently correlated to the destruction of communities and local neighborhoods, where the highways would go right through and divide neighborhoods, and then those neighborhoods never really recovered. Now, again, that's a trade-off, right? The highway allows us to get more quickly from one place to another, and it brings a whole set of blessings, but they're not unmitigated blessings, right? There's also a series of negative trade-offs that come about for sure. Yeah. Yeah, really good. So I think that type of thinking is how we need to approach any technology, right? Whether it's the car, whether it's a computer, whether it's a cell phone, whether it's AI, whatever it is, you need to think about the trade-offs that are occurring there. So I think that's a big myth that needs to get busted. In the presentation, I also talked about a myth that technology is neutral, right? You guys heard this one, I'm sure.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think it's a
absolutely.
very common way of thinking that, well, the technology itself is neutral. It's just a matter of how you use it, right?
And yet technology is predisposed to certain things, right? So the pencil is never going to be great for for quick things, or the pencil is not going to be visually stimulating, right? Um, it's going to engage the brain, right? But it's not going to be necessarily a technology we use for relaxing,
Right.
unless someone is really relaxed by writing, which is one of the most difficult things you can ask your brain to do.
Right.
So it's sort of ironic, but technologies are really made for certain components to be interacted with, right? Whether
Sure.
it's your eyes or your fingers or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, great example. A pencil, very simple technology, right? But the principle remains that that was designed by a human for a certain task, right? It's a tool that's
Right.
meant for a certain task. And when you have it in your hand, you're sort of nudged toward that task, right? Of
Right.
writing. Um, you could think the same thing with a hammer, right? When you hold a hammer in your hand, you're nudged towards hammering. What's the saying? When you have a hammer, everything looks like a
Nail.
Nail.
nail, right? It's not deterministic. It's not that because I have a hammer in my hand, therefore I'm going to hammer everything, but it does nudge me, right, towards
Right.
hammering. Because again, it's a designed object, and the way our bodies interact with tools is we're very susceptible then to being nudged in certain directions. That's a huge thing we need to realize that technology is not neutral. They're not found objects. They're designed objects, and especially digital devices, smartphones, computers, and so forth, are designed really to hijack our attention, right? With dings and notifications and push notifications and all sorts of things, right? They're meant to cause us to desire whatever is being put on the screen. So that's an important thing to think about. So that myth, technology is neutral, I think we need to bust by saying instead, technology is a nudge. Okay. Technology is a nudge. And when we realize that, then we can think more carefully about how we should use it, right? That these things are nudging us. We got to think about how they're nudging us. Are they nudging us towards higher goods and things that are most valuable, most beautiful? Or are they nudging us towards things that are, more base and instinctual? Where our desires are disordered. So, yeah, I think that's another big one.
Yeah, I I like how you gave that dichotomy. Are these technologies leading us towards something good for, I know I'm reworking your words, but towards something good for our body, good and holy, and wholesome, right? Or are they doors to other less wholesome avenues, right? Or just things that aren't necessarily good for your body, right? Sitting in one position for 8 hours a day is not good for your body. And yet the computer makes that very likely. The phone makes that very likely, because we can do everything from this one position.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it doesn't even have to be evil. It's just not necessarily good, right?
That's right. It's a lesser good, right? And it's forming us in a certain way, right? Both, spiritually, mentally, and physically. And those are the things we need to think carefully about. And honestly, I think Christians should be leading the way on a lot of these things because we have such a rich understanding of what it means to be a human that many people don't. That we are sort of prepared and we have the framework to think about these things, and I think really become an example of sort of living a humane and human life in the digital age.
Yeah, so when we talk about what it means to be human, I think it might be good to spend a little time talking about that, right? And what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to um, be a human rather than a machine?
Sure.
One that uses machines, one that uses technologies for good, but also is separate from that machine.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Well, I think we go back to Genesis 1 and 2, like you said, right? And I think one of the things we see there is that we are creatures. We are creatures of God. We are not the creator, right? We are creatures. And so what does that mean? Well, it means that God made us with a purpose, that we are not our own, that we belong to Him. And also we see that He created us with bodies, right? Actually, interestingly, the body was created first and
Right.
then he breathes into the body, right? The breath of life. That's really interesting, especially in the ancient context, that the body would have been created first. This is a great confession of the goodness of the human body, which would have been, again, something that would have been somewhat unique at the time,
Mhm.
and isn't unique in our time as well,
Right.
where we're so used to, I think, despising the body and valuing our internal sense of self. We're in an interesting time. In some cases, we despise the body. In other cases, we idolize it, I think, with pornography and weightlifting and, trying to perfect the body and the, picture taking and selfies and Instagram and all the filters you can do, I think sometimes elevate that sense, but it's really a distorted view of the human body. It's really a make-believe view of the human body. So yeah, we're in a time where the body is in some ways sort of despised, in other ways elevated, but it's never grounded in this idea that we're creatures of God and that the body and the soul are united, right? As we said, God creates the body, he breathes into the body the breath of life, and we have the human being. So there's this wonderful unity of the body and soul that is the human person. So to be a creature, we have bodies. God's declared them good. And what's interesting to think about too is those bodies have limits. Even before the fall, the human body was limited. I don't think we think about that enough. Adam and Eve couldn't be everywhere at once, right? They couldn't as more people emerged, they couldn't communicate with everybody at once, right? They would need to be in one location to do so. So there's all sorts of physical limitations of the body that are not bad. And in many ways, our technologies attempt to transcend those limits, right? Like what we're doing right now, right? We're communicating without being physically present in the same space. Now, I'm not saying that's bad, but it is important to recognize that limits our ability to communicate, right? In some way. It puts a damper on a full human interaction. Again, not saying it's bad to do this, right? These are wonderful gifts that allow us to communicate, but we do need to recognize their inherent limitations or the ways they are nudging us, right? So yeah, the limits of our bodies are good. I'm just going to recommend a book here. It's a new book by Jonathan Haidt called The Anxious Generation. Maybe some of you have read that or heard about it already. But he makes the case in this book that really the internet connected digital device really changes how we're living and really has changed childhood. Because so much of childhood is now mediated through the screen. And in the book, he lays out four principles for human flourishing. And he says that the digital world is moving us away from those things. So for one example, he says that human beings are designed for embodied presence with each other, right? But the digital device disembodies us, right? That's one of them. He also says that humans are designed for really small group communication, right? That is either one-to-one or in a small setting. But he says what the digital device does is it moves us into an environment where we can communicate with anyone and everyone all at once, right? He also says that human beings are designed for synchronous communication, right? Communication that's live, right?
Mhm.
Where there's feedback immediately, where you're talking, discussing, and so forth in person. But what's the digital environment in general, especially social media? Well, it's asynchronous, right? You make a posting and then somebody likes it later, right? And then you check it later and you see how many likes you've got, right? It's very asynchronous. And he argues that that's hard for the human being to deal with if that's the main way they're communicating. We're just not wired for that being our primary mode of communication. And then there's a fourth one. I'm drawing a blank on what the fourth one is right now. But it's a very good book. And those principles in the book, I think, are very helpful because a lot of times I think we realize there's like something not quite right in the digital world, but
Yeah.
we don't have the language or the framework to really articulate what it is that actually is going on. And he does a great job of really fleshing that out. What are the real differences that make this such a struggle for human beings to flourish in the digital environment?
I think that asynchronous category is so telling at what I'm glad you brought that up and that he observed it. I think that is for me the most disconcerting part of communication via digital. Like, we've talked about this as
Yeah.
our Wife for Life team and doing videos and those sort of things. And I know that it is necessary as the director of Wife for Life to do videos, but it's
Sure.
not one of my favorite things. In fact,
Right.
I would put it on my lower half of the things that I like the least.
Yeah.
Just because, again, that communication seems so unnatural, right?
Right.
I'm not talking this. I love getting into a classroom or being in front of a group of people and speaking, and then having that interaction, getting a chance to see their facial expressions and
Right.
to recognize, okay, they're understanding what I'm saying, right? Or they disagree, so let's talk about this.
Yeah.
But it's the disconnect, right? And then I come back later and, 1,600 people have seen it, or 500 people, or one,
Right.
like, and how
Yeah.
does that even work, right?
Yeah.
Why is it that some things I say, we have 1,600 whatever, or
Sure.
3,000 whatever, and then some 20 people see,
Right.
again, like, it's just, there's no interaction. And again, it's very difficult for me as a communicator, as
Yeah.
a former teacher, to be in that space and feel comfortable in that space.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I don't know, maybe it's different generationally, Cori, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, well, so I mean, part of it that I'm thinking of too, though, is like, so asynchronous communication is not new. Like letter writing was very asynchronous.
Very good.
Emailing before social media was very asynchronous. But even then, there wasn't the same, like you were writing it for one person or a small group of people. It wasn't going just out for the entire world to see. And there weren't algorithms dictating who was going to see it, what the reach was going to be. I think that's the most disconcerting part of social media as a whole, and the most anxiety inducing, is because you don't know who's going to see it, you don't know what the reach is going to be. Whereas when it's a more intentional form of asynchronous communication, texting or letter writing or emailing, it's going to, like I said, one person or a small group of people, and they're likely to respond, especially if you know them personally, you know how long it will take them to respond, or something of that nature. So the shift in asynchronous communications has been very hard, as a younger millennial for me, especially to navigate, because again, we're being moved away from the in-person communication to the digital communication, and even into that asynchronous, the social media communication. And it's just been the shift that I've grown up with, and I've had to just get used to it. Because I've grown with it. It's not been forced upon me like older generations.
But
Very perceptive. Yeah. Really what you're getting at there, I think, is twofold. One, the scale of older forms of asynchronous communication was much more humane. Like you said, one-to-one letter writing or small group. And then the
the
pace,
response,
right?
right?
What's that?
With a response, right? I mean,
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah, not
Right.
just a like.
Exactly. Yeah, I was going to get to that, right? The
Okay.
like button and how revolutionary that was for human beings. And the other thing is pace, right? It was a much more humane pace, we might say, right? The letter writing process, you send it, you think about it, you write it, and then somebody reads it and thinks about it and sends it back. So yeah, what's happened with the social media environment is that pace is sped up, the scale has become inhumane, and then as Michelle said, the type of responses is not humane either, right? It's either a smiley face, a heart, a frown, right? Whatever all the different images you can use on the different platforms, right? And that is not a type of interaction that we're really designed for. And so, as you said, you're living through this change, right? And you're trying to navigate that. And this is a point Haidt brings up in the book, is that we can't change fast enough to keep up with that, right? Now he's coming from a bit of an evolutionary perspective, okay, and that is one of the weaknesses of the book. But it doesn't affect the argument of the book. I'm just being honest about his rationale here. But he would argue that, well, we just can't evolve quickly enough to keep up with these technological changes, right? Well, we would say it's not how we were designed from the beginning, and we're never
Right.
going to evolve to keep up with those changes, right? Do you see my point?
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, and I remember the fourth one, if I could add in the fourth thing he says. And he says that the fourth difference between the digital world and he calls it the real world, is that the barrier to enter or exit a community was significant. Okay. So in a human environment, to be a part of a family, to be a part of community, it means something, right? Um, Online, you can join any group or any niche or anything, and there's really a very low bar to entry and exit, which really creates a meaningless community, he argues, right? Which is another interesting aspect of this as well. Now, again, his point and my point here isn't to say that that means we shouldn't use any of these things. It is to realize their inherent limitations and make sure that we are not having them be our primary mode of living.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, even with those communities that you can enter into and out of so easily, when we look at things like transgenderism, when we look at gender dysphoria, a lot of those decisions are being made based on that electronic community, based on the community that is supporting them, right? Supporting the transition, or supporting the I think I might be. And yet, again, as you mentioned, those communities are not necessarily, those aren't solid, and they're not necessarily trustworthy. I mean, we don't even know those people's in those people in the communities, right? In general, we don't know them.
Yeah.
And they come and go. And yet the popularity, the number of likes, the sway that a online community has on an individual's life is disproportionately large, when you think about whether or not you should be trusting this community, right?
Right. Well, and think about what we even call those people. We call them influencers, right?
Yeah. Right.
Influencers,
Right.
which reveals just how much weight we're putting on them. And like you said, we don't even know if they're trustworthy. They're not really in our any form of robust human community with us.
Right. Very interesting. Let's talk about the bodiliness of Christ, right? Because when we talk about the gift of the body, and that the fact that the body is good, we can be certain that the body is good, not only because we have been made in the body, not only because of Genesis, but because Christ came in the body, right? So for someone maybe who is struggling with this idea of and really it's all of us, right? We all struggle with creating a body that is of our own image rather than the image of God. What can we draw from Christ? How can we draw from Christ's example and his very flesh, not just his example, right? But the gift of his flesh to us, as we navigate a world full of technologies.
Yeah, I really think this is what I might call the defeater for AI and transhumanism. Both AI and transhumanism are really disembodied things, right?
Mm-hmm.
AI doesn't have a body, and the attempts of transhumanism is to really transcend the body and move beyond its limitations. And we have such a powerful response, not only in creation, right, being creatures made in the image of God, but then the fact that God himself takes on flesh, right? What a profound thing. And I think if we think about this in relation to technology, it's really fascinating. We know that the New Testament tells us that Jesus came at the fullness of time. Paul uses this language multiple times in his epistles. In other words, this is like the perfect moment for God to take on flesh, was the exact time when Jesus came into the world. And it's interesting to reflect about that. Have you ever thought about that? What about this moment was perfect? Why did Paul call this the fullness of time, the pleroma of Kairos?
Yeah, I mean, we can't climb inside of God's head, right? We don't
Sure.
know. But yes, this perfect time, and when you look at the brokenness of the world that Christ was born into, it really was the perfect time, right? I mean, a lot of the things that we're dealing with today were in existence then, right? The very reason that very reason Christ's parents are heading to Bethlehem is associated with homosexuality. I mean, that's part of the reason that they're having a census, because homosexuality become so popular that the number of people being born, of children being born, had decreased, right? So we see, and it's obviously it's not just that issue, but we have lots of life issues that are coming into into play at this time. And so, just from a life perspective, it was the perfect time for God to come, for Christ to come.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that's really fascinating. So you're talking about the
the
sort of in the
census.
Roman Empire and
Yep.
the sexuality standards
Yep.
that were there were really leading to a decline of births and so forth. That's fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, it was, it was seen as belittling to a man to have sex with a woman at that time. That the desired, you only did that to produce an heir, right?
Right.
But actually, the popular or the more accepted relationship was homosexuality, and because of that, they saw a huge decrease, obviously, in their population, and the Roman Empire was concerned that they would not have enough people to man their war. And so a census was being taken, right?
Interesting.
Um,
Interesting.
yeah,
Yeah.
it is culturally, we just, when we see the decrease in population in America and around the world, Christ came into a time very similar.
Yeah, that's interesting. Um, the Roman Empire is fascinating, right? There's all these complexities there where on a lot of moral and sexual issues, they are really precursors to what we're seeing today. Um, and then in some ways, we see things like their road system and their ability to allow for transport of goods and people in a way that allowed Jesus to move about that region, to communicate with many people, for the apostles to do so. Um, this was during the Pax Romana, which was fairly peaceful time, all things considered. Um, what's also interesting to think about with this time he comes is that he came at a time where he would have to be with other people to communicate his message, or there would have to be letter writing for his message to be communicated, right? There was no video, there was no phone, there was no radio, there was no television, right? There was no internet. It's fascinating just to think about that, of all the times he could have come, and again, we're peering behind the curtain here a little bit, I realize. But this was the perfect time for God in the flesh to come to earth, was a time where he would have to be with people for his message to spread, and for him to heal, right, to preach and so forth. It was either in person or letters, right? I think that's pretty profound to think about. Not even cars were around yet, right?
Right.
So God had to walk. All right, I know I'm saying it provocatively, but we have a 3 mile an hour God in some ways. There's a Japanese theologian who has a book by that title, and it's there's some pretty profound reflections in the book. And again, it's provocatively worded, but Jesus had to walk around the
Mhm.
world to communicate his message, to be with people. And then he goes more. He actually stops. He stops on the cross, right? And dies.
Right.
Um, and that just says a lot, again, about the body, about this world, about what it means to be a person, that God has taken on the flesh of mankind, that he has walked the earth, that he has touched people, healed them, right? Um, uh, Spit and made mud and put it on their eyes and put fingers in people's ears and touched caskets. I mean, he was just, it was such a bodily thing, the way he did his ministry, right? That's just such a great thing to think about. And again, I think it's an answer to the digital world. And not only that, this God in the flesh comes to us, as we've already mentioned, right? He comes
Right.
to us in the divine service through the Lord's Supper, through the Holy Eucharist, where we receive his body and blood for the forgiveness of sins. We're united to him in his body in our baptism. These are just profound things that we participate in. And yes, they are mysterious. We can never plumb their depths, but in some very real way, we are really connected to the body of Christ, right?
Mhm.
Um, in these sacraments and in the word proclaimed. And that is the mystery of mysteries for sure.
Absolutely. And definitely something to ponder as we as we think about how we can serve our neighbor, right? As we think about what it means to be a Christian in the world today, what it means to be to be a light, to be salt, to be the carrier of Christ's message, right? Not only did God make us relational, but He is a relational God, and we see that when we bring the message of salvation to others, it is best received through relationships, best not only received but also maintained, upheld, right? Where we have these conversions that are lifelong, rather than momentary. But yeah, just as far as how we do that, then, right? How we interact with others. Certainly, we have this gift of the digital world, but we also need to use our hands and our arms and our voices.
Yeah, and this is the wonderful thing about our understanding of vocation, right? That God uses us to reach others, to bring others into relationship with Him, that we are the masks of God, we are the hands of God in a certain sense. So yeah, these gifts that we receive of Christ's body and blood in the church, this wonderful union we have with Him through word and sacrament, now that sort of we go out of the church and that flows through us as we serve our neighbors through our vocations. And that means, as you said, that we're going to be in relationship with other human beings, right? Whether that's coworkers, family, fellow students, friends, neighbors, whatever it is, we are designed to be in those networks of relationship, those frameworks for human flourishing. And that should really, really be the driving force of what we're doing in the world, is those human to human relationships, for sure. I think also, like we said, some of those principles of how humans are best designed to flourish from Jonathan Haidt's book, I think, are helpful to think about. Again, it's not that we can't use the digital world and benefit from the things that we can from it, but we do need to keep in mind that the human being has a certain design, right? And we can't not recognize that and participate in it in some way. So, I mean, there'd be lots of practical pieces of advice we could talk about if you want to. Were you going to add something in there?
Yeah, no, I thought that you mentioned a book, right? That someone else published, but you have one coming out too. And I don't want to overlook that. So I don't know if you want to talk about that now, or I think
Yeah.
it is okay too to, talk about some practical things, ways that people can uphold lives. But let's take a little detour here, and I'm hoping it's not too far off. I'm guessing it's not too far off because of the title of your book. But so tell us about it.
Yeah. So this has been a long project in the works, couple years. I've been working with a friend, Robin Phillips. He and I are both sort of thinking about these things for a long time. We've been thinking about them for a long time and writing about them. Um, and we've put together this joint book project called "Are We All Cyborgs Now?" And the subtitle is "Reclaiming Our Humanity from the Machine." And in the book, we talk about a lot of the things we talked about today in much more length. But we really tried to put together a resource for people trying to figure out how we live in this digital age. So there's a section in the book that deals with education and technology. There's a section in the book that deals with the church and technology, family life and technology, politics and technology. We've got a variety of sections that deal with different issues, depending on what the reader wants to learn more about. So, it is a book. It's a pretty long book. It's 480 pages, I think the total ended up being. I guess that's what happens when you put two authors together. Um, but it can be read straight through, and it's definitely it's all interconnected in that way. But it's also meant to be something somebody could pick up and read a chapter if they're interested in an issue, or a section if they're interested in an issue. The main thing we're trying to do is give people a framework for thinking about technological questions, right?
Yeah,
And that can then help them as new questions come up, right? We can't predict everything that's going to emerge, but what
right.
we can do is try to give people a framework for thinking about these issues. And what we do over and over again is we come back to the life of the church, the types of things we talked about with Christ, and the sacramental life that we participate in the divine service. We also talk a lot about what we call sort of liberal arts learning and the great tradition that humans can participate in to reclaim their humanity. We also talk a lot about things we can do with your hands, like you were saying, right? We have bodies for a reason, and we should use them. And maybe that's playing an instrument, maybe that's playing a sport, right? Maybe that's picking up a hobby, whatever it is. Our bodies are meant to be used. So there's quite a bit of practical advice in the book as well. We have multiple chapters devoted specifically to practical tips and advice for living in the digital world. So we really hope it's going to reach different types of readers. And as I said, you don't have to read the whole thing. Pick what will work with your vocations and your spot in life. It's off to a pretty good start. It's been out for a week, and if you play the Amazon algorithm game, it's ranked in the top 10 in what they categorize it as computers and technology education. So it's off to a
Awesome.
pretty good start. Yeah.
Yeah, congratulations. That's wonderful.
Thanks.
Yeah, I look forward to it. I actually, before this interview, went ahead and, dropped it in my basket at Amazon. And I could tell while you were talking that Cori was getting on her computer and looking it up. I know that look.
Yeah.
So yeah, I look forward to it. And it kind of reminds me of just a format of Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman, where he takes, topic by topic and says, okay, how does technology then shape? How has this topic been shaped by technology, or how has our desire for amusing ourselves been seen throughout in education, in religion, those sort of things. So, but I love the fact that you've got that the Christian component, right? Neil Postman didn't have that.
Right. Well, what's funny is the book is dedicated to Postman.
Is it? Oh, that's great. That's great. Yeah.
Yeah. He's been a big influence on both of our thinking. And is a very important thinker on these issues for sure. But as you said, the Christian element was missing there. So yeah, we do try to connect those dots. And that's another thing with Haidt's book as well. And a lot of these books that are being written right now, they have a lot of good things to offer. But I think we can help connect the dots a little bit more fully to, like we said, the creation, right? That we are created in the image of God and all that means. And then also ultimately to Christ, the true human, right?
Yeah.
Who we are united to. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so exciting that you're connecting those dots, and as Christians, that is one of the things that we can do best, right? To share, to use this gift of logic and then connect it back to the creator of that logic, right? The creator of our bodies, the creator of our wisdom. So the giver of wisdom. So let's end the podcast by giving maybe some practical advice. How do we, in a digital world, how do we convey, how do we reflect Christ to the world, and Christian living in a world that has bought into AI and transhumanism?
Well, it might mean we look a little weird. And that's okay. Christians have always been weird. And it actually turns out being pretty attractive to people when they see a different way of being, right? Not always, but there's something attractive about somebody who's rooted in the permanent things, who's not always anxiously scrolling, who's not driven by the fads of pop culture. So I would encourage people to be willing to be weird. Now, what I mean by that, I'll give you some practical things that might flesh that out. One is that, maybe we're not always connected to our device, right? That it's not always at our hip and in our hands. We need breaks from such things. Again, it's not that those things are bad, but it's important to take breaks. So there's a lot of different recommendations people have put forward on this. One is an hour a day a week, and a week a year. Now, those aren't laws by any stretch. Those are just principles you may want to think about. Is there an hour during the day where I'm not connected to a device or I'm not in front of a screen, right? Maybe it should be more than an hour, but at least that's a starting point, right? So an hour a day. Is there a day a week, maybe, where we take a break from our phones, or at least a portion of a day? And I think a great time to do that is church.
Right.
Maybe just leave your phone in the car during church, right? As a starting point. That's something that I've started doing, my wife and I, the last few years. When we go to divine service, we just leave our phones in the car. Again, not a law. I'm not binding anyone's conscience by saying this. I'm just suggesting some practical wisdom, right? Ways you might think about doing this. And again, it doesn't have to be that, but think about ways you can take breaks from your devices. And that's just a very simple thing. I think another thing is to develop hobbies that require bodily skill, like we said, maybe music, art, traditional handcrafts, something, car repair, all sorts of things, something that requires you to experience sort of risk and strain and challenge with your body. This is another thing that's fascinating when it comes to the human body, is that we need those risks and challenges as beings, right? We're not designed to be coddled.
Right.
We are designed to be pushing the envelope with our bodies and with our minds, and that actually causes us to grow as people, both physically and mentally. So that's another thing that the digital world, I think, works against, right? In the digital world, we're always in control, and it's so sort of flawless and smooth and frictionless. Human beings need risk. We need friction, both in relationship and in the physical world. So those are things to think about as well there. And you might try to, get together with your friends or family or people in your church to try to come up with some things you can do together. I think that's another big thing. If you're just trying to do these things alone, it's very difficult to fight against the sort of the machine that we're in. But if you do it together, then you have both accountability and you have more fun, right? So
Right.
maybe get together and host a phone freedom event, right? Maybe make a meal and don't have your phones, right? Maybe go out on a picnic and don't bring your phones. I don't know, anything. There's all sorts of things you could do, and there's some glimmers of hope on this actually. There's actually a growing number of folks, and Cori, maybe you could comment on this, that are younger that are going back to flip phones, right?
Yep.
Yep.
They've realized that their parents were sort of addicted to the smartphone, and maybe even they were for a while. So they're saying, hey, I'm going to go back to a dumb phone. There's actually a bunch of companies that are making dumb phones now.
Mhm.
Do you want to say anything on that, Cori? Have you seen that?
Yeah, well, so that's something though I've noticed too, that younger parents, so I guess like either those who are going back to the flip phone or who are realizing like we don't have a landline anymore,
Yeah.
but I don't want to give my child who's in third grade a cell phone. Like that's not developmentally appropriate. So what are we going to do? And I've seen a lot of families having the discussion of, well, let's have like a home phone, but have it be a flip phone or a dumb phone, something like that. So it's pre-programmed with the numbers that you need to call mom, dad,
Yeah.
or other emergency contacts. But it's something that if it's home with a babysitter, then there's still a way to contact mom and dad when they're out of the house. Or when the child goes out with friends, like you can only call mom and dad, like, hey, I'm ready to be picked up. They're not on a smartphone. So again, just that the shift too for parents of, I'm not buying my child a smartphone in third grade. They have no reason to need it. In fact, I'm not going to buy
Yeah.
them a smartphone at all.
Right.
And will be the push has been phone free till eighth grade.
Yeah.
But I think it goes beyond that. I didn't have my first phone until I was a little over a year into high school, and that's just
Yep.
because I would ride my bike from my house to school, and my mom wanted a way to contact me if needed, but it wasn't a smartphone, it was a dumb phone, and it was something I paid for myself.
Yeah.
As I grew up and could afford something different, I did get a smartphone. But again, I think that idea of providing for children what they can afford and what they need. They don't need a smartphone, and I think a lot of young parents are recognizing that about themselves too, is I don't need a smartphone. I have it for entertainment,
Yeah.
but I don't need to be constantly entertained. My children, my husband, my neighbor, those are the people that I need to be in community with. So those are the things I've been noticing, and things that I've been seeing come about of the shift a little bit in thinking.
Yeah, that's great. I love those creative ideas, right? And that's the type of thing that we need to be doing. And again, coming together on some of those things is really helpful. You realize you're not alone. Just a few other ones here as well. I would say we got to think about how we organize our space in the home. This is again just very practical, but your phone should not be in your bedroom. This
Right.
is just common sense, right? There should be spaces in your home where those devices don't go. So how can you organize the space in your home so that the default isn't always the screen, right? So maybe that means instead of having like the computer and the phone be the central devices of a space, maybe put like a stack of board games and some books on the table, right? Something that your first thing you're going to grab is something that's going to require you to interact with others or interact in a more a deep way with something, right? Maybe it means having a guitar in the corner or a keyboard in the corner. By keyboard, I mean like piano, not
Mhm.
like a computer keyboard, right?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's another thing to think about, space, the way we organize space. Those are just some of the things. There's much more about it in the book, and there's a lot of others that have put together good lists of suggestions to help us figure this thing out.
I think one of the things we can add to the list is just the practice of bringing back the practice of hospitality, and the gathering together, making it part of our daily lives, or maybe it's not daily, maybe it's weekly, right, or monthly, where you set aside a day where this is when we gather with other people. When obviously when we have our families inside our own homes, that would be great to get to gather daily at the dinner table, right? Or breakfast or supper, whatever the meal is. But the practice of hospitality, inviting others into your home and making that part of a priority in your life. Um, and during that time, again, like you mentioned with the picnic, going without your phones, going phone free. Having the board games, those sorts of things, having time for discussion and modeling that for our children is really important, because in my interaction with young people, it's very clear some are very uncomfortable maintaining a conversation. They don't know how to do that,
Mhm.
right? Um, but uh, again, that's not all. But one of the other things that I have seen, as far as transitions, is not just um, a transition in whether or not they can have conversations, but also um, times for social media, right? So those that are maybe have a more difficult time with conversations are often the ones who have the phone out, right?
Mhm.
So even just having it in the pocket or in the purse or in the backpack, rather than in the hand, and just that rule of thumb. Is helpful. I know when I used to teach high school, if I was talking to a student who would ask to come in after class and ask me questions, as soon as they pulled out the phone, I'd say, okay, so I'm seeing that maybe our conversation is done. Oh, no, no, no. And and just explaining to them, well, you've brought in a third conversation piece, whether it's another human being on the text or those sorts of things. But when you bring out the phone, it indicates that the conversation is over rather than it's just on pause, right? So teaching some of those skills as well, are
Yeah,
that's
that's
important.
really good. There's actually some interesting studies about the phone being out and what that does to both attention and anxiety, right?
Mm.
When the phone is out on the table or visible, our attention decreases and our anxiety goes up. And
Interesting.
that fits exactly with what you're saying there. And I'm really glad you brought up hospitality. That is so huge, and it's such a Christian concept, right? I mean,
Yeah,
think of all the meals in the scriptures, right? Where God comes to his people in relation to food. Obviously, the climax of that is the Lord's Supper, right?
right,
So God shares his radical hospitality with us, right, in the supper. And then it's like we flow out of that, and then we have hospitality to others, right?
right.
I like to think of there being three tables. There's the Eucharistic table, right, where we partake of Christ's own body and blood. Then there's what I like to call the parish table, where we partake of food together as a church, right, in the parish hall,
Mhm.
or other places, right, with friends that are part of the body of Christ. And then there's also the table of the home, right, where, like you said, we welcome people into our home, right? Crossing the threshold of a home is a very intimate thing, that is so powerful. And there's
Yes.
actually a lot of this that plays a role in evangelism, and bringing people into the church as well. There's a wonderful book on this by Rosaria Butterfield, called "The Gospel Has a House Key."
Mm.
And basically, she was, just to summarize real quickly, she was a lesbian, if I recall correctly. She was part of the LGBT community in some way. You can correct me if one of you remember the details better than I do. But it was a pastor who began inviting her to come to his house and have dinner with his family.
Mhm.
And this was a big part of her starting to get to know Christians, and start to ask questions. And eventually she became a Christian, right?
Yeah,
And hospitality was a huge part of that. Yeah, so that's a big one. I'm glad you brought that up.
yeah. Wow. Well, thank you, Vicar Pauling, so much for joining us today to talk about AI and transhumanism, and maybe even more so ways that we can, as Christians, proclaim Christ in the goodness of body and relationships, even as we live in a world where we are exposed to and actually using some of these things. So thank you very much. And if we'll go ahead and put your book in the notes for this podcast, as well as the other books that you mentioned. But if people have questions and want to reach out to you, how would it be best for them to reach you?
Well, if we want to go real old school, they could send me a letter. No, I'm just they could
That would
email
be
me
perfect.
at jpauling.com or jpauling@hotmail.com is my email address. I'd be happy to. I always love discussing these things and hearing from people what's working and what isn't. That's probably the easiest way. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thanks again for your time and for joining us today. And for those of you who are listening, we hope that you share this with others and join us for our next session. Have a great day. Thanks for joining us for today's life topic. Check out whyforlife.org or email Michelle at whyforlife.org to find out how and when you can go live with us at our next Chats for Life session. Or join us next time, right here at Why for Life Podcasts, where youth learn how to be gospel-motivated voices for life.